That night, a storm tore through the city's sky. In the flickering light of the security camera, I saw my father, Mark Ellison, fling open the back door and coldly shove my grandfather out onto the porch. My grandfather trembled in his old coat, rain lashing his silver hair, his frail frame swaying. My mother stood there, silent, letting the man who had given them everything shiver in the cold wind. I watched the scene unfold on the screen, frozen, and in that moment I knew my family had lost the most precious thing, their humanity. A few weeks later, my grandfather passed away in my arms. But as I sorted through his belongings, I discovered an old diary and a contract he had kept hidden. In them, he had documented the truth about the months of deception and left me a final wish I never could have anticipated. Hello, my name is Caleb Ellison. I'm 25 years old, living and working in Billings, Montana, a small city nestled among endless fields where dusty roads lead you past dairy farms and weathered wooden houses. Billings isn't glamorous, but it has the soul of the American West. Fiery red sunsets, winds carrying the scent of dry grass, and people who live slowly tied to the land. I'm an Uber driver navigating my old pickup truck through familiar streets, ferrying passengers from the airport to their homes or from bars to residential neighborhoods. The job isn't hectic, but it's enough to get by, enough to give me time to drive over an hour to Sheridan County, Wyoming, where my grandfather, Warren Ellison, lived alone on the family ranch. I always felt I belonged there, at that ranch. It wasn't just a piece of land, it was an entire world. Hundreds of acres stretched out where beef and dairy cattle grazed leisurely. Old barns stood tall beside the weathered wooden house. It was the Ellison family legacy, passed down through generations, steeped in the sweat and love of those who lived and died for it. To me, the ranch was where I grew up, where my grandfather taught me how to milk cows, fix fences, and most importantly, how to live with kindness and integrity. Caleb, he'd say in his warm, steady voice, land isn't just something to own. It's something to preserve, to tell your family's story. My grandfather, Warren Ellison, was a rugged, weathered man but full of compassion. At 78, he still carried the air of a true rancher. Calloused hands, a face etched with wrinkles like a map of his life, and bright eyes, though dimmed by age. He was once the strongest man I knew, but in recent years I noticed him weakening. His hands began to tremble, his steps grew slower, and his voice no longer carried its old resonance. My grandmother passed away 6 years ago, leaving a gaping hole in his heart. I still remember the day she died, him sitting on the porch, staring at the fields, silent, quietly wiping tears. From then on, he lived alone at the ranch, but I knew he wasn't truly alone. He had his cattle, his fields, and memories of my grandmother. And he had me. I drove up to Sheridan County often to visit him, helping with small tasks, fixing pipes, cleaning the barn, or just sitting with him, listening to his stories. His tales always began with, "Back when your grandmother and I were young," and ended with a lesson about honesty, love, or living without regrets. He was strict, but I never saw him angry without reason. He always taught me that honor and family tradition were worth more than money. "Caleb," he once said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "a man doesn't need to be rich, but he must live so others respect him." Not everyone in the family shared his values. My father, Mark Ellison, was the complete opposite. At 52, he had grown up on the ranch but despised the farming life from a young age. He often spoke of waking up at 4 in the morning to milk cows, the bone-chilling Wyoming winters, and the grueling work that never seemed to promise a brighter future. "Stuck in this God-forsaken place my whole life," he'd say, his voice dripping with bitterness. My father left the ranch as soon as he could, moving to Billings and opening a small restaurant. He dreamed of a comfortable, wealthy life where he wouldn't have to get mud on his boots. But his restaurant never truly succeeded. It limped along, sometimes busy, sometimes empty, and recently I heard he was drowning in debt. My father was ambitious, but his ambition was laced with selfishness. He valued money and flashy things, a new car, a big house, expensive clothes. To him, my grandfather's ranch wasn't a legacy, but a piece of land that could be turned into cash. I once overheard him talking to my mother, his voice full of resentment. If the old man would just sell that ranch, we'd have been living in a big city by now. Every time he called my grandfather the old man, my heart ached. To my father, his father wasn't the man who sacrificed everything to raise him, but an obstacle, someone holding on to what he coveted. My mother, Elaine, 50, was a hairdresser in Billings. She was skilled, good with people, and always knew how to please her clients. But at home, she sided with my father. She rarely contradicted him, though sometimes I caught her sighing quietly when he lost his temper. My mother wasn't cruel, but she was swept up in my father's ambitions. She too dreamed of a cushy life where she wouldn't have to work her fingers to the bone. To her, my grandfather was also a burden. I once heard her say, her voice low but sharp, "If your grandfather wasn't at the ranch, things would be so much easier." Those words cut like a knife, but I tried to convince myself she didn't mean it. After all, she was still my mother. Our family was never perfect, but after my grandmother's death, the cracks became undeniable. My grandfather grew lonelier. He never said it, but I saw it in the way he sat alone on the porch, his eyes distant. I tried to spend more time with him, not just out of love, but because I felt like the only one who still truly cared. My parents visited him in Sheridan County too, but those visits weren't about family. They had another purpose, one I didn't yet realize. They wanted to convince my grandfather to sell the ranch. I noticed recently that my parents were visiting the ranch more often. But their visits weren't like before. No cheerful stories or warm family dinners. Instead, they came with a calculated air that I only recognized when it was too late. My father, Mark, always started with sweet words, his voice smooth like a seasoned salesman. "Dad, you've worked your whole life," he said, sitting across from my grandfather in the small living room of the wooden house. "It's time to rest. You don't need to wake up early to tend the cows or worry about harsh winters anymore. Sell the ranch, Dad, I'll take care of you." My mother, Elaine, always backed him up. She sat beside him, hands clasped tightly, flashing a smile I knew was fake. "That's right, Dad. In the city, you'll have better hospitals, better doctors. You'll be closer to us, to Caleb. We'll take care of you for the rest of your life." I sat there, listening, feeling a weight like a stone pressing on my chest. Their words sounded reasonable, but something felt off. My grandfather's eyes, usually bright when he spoke of the ranch, now dimmed, as if he were being backed into a corner. My grandfather wasn't easily swayed. To him, the ranch wasn't just land. It was the blood and sweat of him and my grandmother. The long days working under the scorching sun, the freezing winter nights when they repaired storm-damaged fences together. It was the Ellison family legacy, where he was born, where his father was born, and where he hoped I would carry on. "This isn't something to sell," he said, his voice firm but weary. "This land is our story. Selling it would be like selling our family's honor." His words warmed my heart, but they also angered my father. I saw the way he clenched his fists, his lips tightening as he tried to hold back. "Honor?" he muttered, low enough that my grandfather didn't hear, but I did. "Honor doesn't pay the bills." My mother patted his shoulder, signaling him to stay calm, but I knew they wouldn't give up. They wanted the ranch, not because they loved it, but for the money it could bring. To my father, the ranch was a chance to change his life. A piece of land worth millions, enough to save his failing restaurant, enough to buy a big house in the city, a luxury car, and all the things he'd dreamed of since leaving Wyoming. In the months that followed, the pressure from my parents intensified. They visited more often, each time armed with sweet but sharp words. They painted a picture of a comfortable life where my grandfather would be well cared for, free from the burdens of livestock or harsh weather. "You're getting old, Dad," my mother said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "You can't live alone forever. If something happens, who'll be there for you?" I wanted to shout that I would be there, that I'd never leave him alone. But I stayed silent. I just sat there watching my grandfather, trying to read his thoughts through his tired eyes. I began to notice hesitation in him. My grandfather was strong, but my grandmother's death had taken a piece of his vitality. Though he had the cattle and pigs as companions, I knew he had moments of silence, moments of loneliness. On evenings by the porch, he'd stare out at the fields, murmuring about the old days when my grandmother was still here, when everything felt whole. My parents exploited that loneliness. They knew he was more vulnerable than ever, and they used it as a weapon. "Don't you want to be close to your family?" my father asked, his voice laced with implication. "Do you want Caleb to worry about you forever? Sell the ranch, and everything will be easier." I hated how they dragged me into their narrative as if I agreed with their plan, but I felt powerless. I was just an Uber driver, living in a small apartment in Billings without enough money or influence to stand up to my parents. All I could do was be there for my grandfather, help him fix fences, milk cows, and remind him I loved him. But each time my parents came, I saw him waver a little more. He started asking me questions like, "Caleb, do you think I should rest? Or do you think your parents would really take care of me?" I wanted to scream that no, they weren't trustworthy, that they only wanted his money. But I couldn't. I didn't want to break his heart further. Then one day, after months of pressure from my parents, my grandfather called me out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the Wyoming fields red. He sat in his old wooden chair, holding a cold cup of coffee. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and weary, "I've been thinking a lot. Maybe it's time to let go." My heart tightened. "Let go of what, Grandpa?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He stared out at the fields, his eyes distant. "The ranch. Maybe your parents are right. I'm old, I can't keep going. If I sell it, I could live closer to you, to family." I wanted to protest, to tell him the ranch was his life, that he couldn't give it up. But I saw his eyes, the eyes of a tired, lonely man trying to do what was best for those he loved. I took his hand, squeezed it gently, and said, "Whatever you do, as long as you're happy." But deep down, I knew he wasn't happy. He was compromising, and the cost of that compromise would be steep. Not long after, my grandfather agreed to sell the ranch. The contract was signed quickly, overseen by a lawyer my father hired. The sum of $3.5 million, an enormous amount, was transferred to my father's account. My grandfather handed over the money, saying only one thing, his voice trembling. "I don't need anything but a roof over my head and care. Look after me until the end like you promised." My father nodded, flashing a smile I knew was fake. "Of course, Dad," he said. "I'll take care of everything." My mother patted my grandfather's shoulder, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed joy. They had gotten what they wanted. A week later, I was tasked with picking up my grandfather and helping him pack. When I arrived at the ranch, he was sitting on the porch, looking out at the fields one last time. I sat beside him, saying nothing, just watching the sunset in silence. "Do you remember the day your grandmother burned those cookies?" he suddenly asked, his voice soft. I smiled, nodding. "I remember. You ate them anyway so she wouldn't feel bad." He smiled too, but the smile faded quickly. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he said, his voice dropping. "But I trust your father. I trust family." I wanted to tell him my father wasn't trustworthy, that I had a bad feeling. But I couldn't. I just hugged him, feeling his frail frame in my arms. "Everything will be okay, Grandpa," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. As we left the ranch, I glanced back at the wooden house one last time. It stood there, silent, like an old friend abandoned. And in my heart, a growing unease swelled, like a storm approaching from afar. After receiving the money from the sale of the ranch, my parents quickly put it to use. They bought a larger house in an upscale neighborhood with lush green trees and neatly trimmed lawns. The house was 3 stories tall, painted white, with gleaming glass windows, looking like it had stepped out of an architectural magazine. My father sold the old house and cleared out all its furnishings to move into the new one. Not long after, a shiny SUV appeared in the garage along with expensive furniture that my mother couldn't stop boasting about. "We wanted a fresh start," she said, her voice brimming with pride as she showed her friends around the living room, where a massive leather sofa held court. "Now we can live the way we deserve." I was given a room on the 3rd floor, though I rarely used it. My grandfather was assigned a room on the 2nd floor. At first, I have to admit, the room seemed thoughtfully arranged. A simple but clean bed, a small wardrobe, and a window overlooking the backyard garden. My parents often mentioned him in front of others, as if he were the center of their filial devotion. "Our father lives with us now," my father told a neighbor one afternoon in the yard, his voice ringing with pride. "He doesn't have to worry about anything anymore. We take care of everything." My mother nodded, adding, "He's worked his whole life. Now it's time for him to rest." Those words sounded pleasant, and I saw my grandfather give a faint smile as if he truly believed selling the ranch was the right choice. He sat in the living room holding a cup of tea, his eyes gentle but still carrying a hint of displacement. "Maybe this is for the best," he said to me once, his voice soft as a breeze. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone." But I knew things weren't that simple. Beneath the facade of happiness my parents put up for outsiders, small cracks began to appear. It started with little things, details only those inside the house would notice. One morning I visited and saw my grandfather struggling to carry a glass of water from the kitchen to the living room. His hands trembled, water spilling onto the floor. My mother stood there, letting out a loud sigh, as if the few drops he spilled were enough to infuriate her. "Dad, leave it alone, you're too clumsy to do anything," she said, her voice barely hiding her irritation. My grandfather just lowered his head, offering a weak smile, but I saw his eyes. The eyes of a man who once stood tall against storms, now wounded by cold, cutting words. On later visits, I noticed my parents starting to call him the annoying old man whenever I came by. I overheard my mother whispering to my father in the kitchen when they thought I wasn't nearby. If he wasn't here, we wouldn't have to deal with all this nonsense. My father nodded, his voice icy. "He just needs to sit still, but he keeps messing things up." I stood in the hallway, fists clenched, wanting to storm in and yell that he wasn't a burden, that he was the one who gave them everything. But I couldn't. I just quietly walked into my grandfather's room, sat beside him, and tried to make him smile with stories about the quirky passengers I drove for Uber. I started monitoring the household through the security camera system I had installed for my parents earlier. Once I saw them come home late, my father, likely tipsy, shouting at my grandfather just because he asked if they had bought his medication. "What more do you want? Haven't we done enough for you?" my father yelled, his voice echoing through the screen. My mother stood there, silent, her eyes cold as if she agreed. My heart felt crushed every time I opened the camera app. As time passed, my parents' patience wore thin. The costs of my grandfather's medication and hospital visits started to irritate my father. I heard him grumble about financial burdens when he opened a hospital bill for my grandfather's worsening cough. "If I'd known it'd be like this, I wouldn't have agreed to let him live here," he said to my mother once, his voice bitter. My mother said nothing, just nodded, her eyes cold with agreement. My grandfather's room, once carefully arranged, was turned into a partial storage space. Cardboard boxes, old bags, and even spare furniture were piled in the corner. His bed was pushed against the wall, the space so cramped he could barely move. His meals became haphazard, often just a bowl of cold soup or a dry piece of bread, while my parents ate lavish meals in the dining room. My mother started dropping hints more openly. "If the old man wasn't here, we'd have so much more freedom," she said to my father one evening when they thought my grandfather was asleep. I was in the living room pretending to watch TV, but I heard every word. My heart felt squeezed. I wanted to run upstairs, hug my grandfather, and tell him I'd take him somewhere, anywhere, as long as it wasn't here. but I didn't have enough money or strength to stand up to my parents. All I could do was small things: bring him a hot plate of food, help him change clothes, or sit and listen to him talk about the old days at the ranch. My grandfather began confiding in me more. He said, his voice trembling, "Caleb, I don't want to be a burden to you or your parents. But sometimes, I feel like I don't belong here." I hugged him, fighting back tears, and said, "You're never a burden, Grandpa. You're family." But inside, I was filled with rage and helplessness. I tried reminding my parents of their promise that they had vowed to care for him until the end. Once, unable to hold back anymore, I confronted my father in the kitchen. "You promised to take care of him," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You can't treat him like this." My father looked at me, his eyes cold as ice. "I don't owe anyone anything," he said sharply. "He gave me the money himself. I didn't force him." Those words stabbed my heart. I turned away, not wanting to argue further with such a stubborn, callous man. I realized that if things continued like this, something would give. The tension in the family was growing, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. And I feared that when it snapped, the one who would suffer most was my grandfather, the man who had sacrificed everything for his family only to be treated like a burden. I checked the cameras more often, not out of curiosity but out of worry for him. Every time I saw him sitting alone, his eyes filled with sadness, it felt like a storm was brewing in my heart. I knew it wouldn't be long before everything exploded. And when it did, I would have to do something, not just to protect my grandfather, but to protect what he had taught me. About honor, about love, and about standing up for what's right. But I didn't expect that moment to come so quickly. It was a cold, stormy day in Billings. From my small apartment, I heard the wind howling through the windows, roaring as if it wanted to swallow the entire city. Rain pounded against the glass, each drop heavy like hammer strikes on my mind. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. The unease about my grandfather had haunted me for weeks, like a thorn lodged deep in my heart. I knew he wasn't okay, wasn't happy, though he always tried to hide his sadness behind a weak smile. Every time I visited, his eyes grew a little more lost, as if he were slowly drifting away from this world. Not because of old age, but because of the wounds my parents inflicted. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I opened the security camera app. In recent days, I'd been checking it more frequently, not out of curiosity, but out of fear that my grandfather wasn't safe. That night, as thunder roared like it was tearing the sky apart, the bad feeling inside me was stronger than ever. I knew if I didn't look at the screen, the anxiety would consume me. But when the image from the kitchen camera loaded, my heart stopped. The dim light from the overhead lamp cast shadows, highlighting my grandfather's frail figure. He sat hunched in a chair, a bowl of cold soup in front of him, his trembling hands struggling to hold a spoon. My father stood by the table, his posture tense, arms crossed as if just being there was too much to bear. My mother stood near the door, her eyes cold, devoid of emotion. I zoomed in, my heart pounding as if I were standing in that kitchen. "I don't want to be a bother." My grandfather's voice came through the phone's speaker, faint but sincere. "I just need some medicine and a bit of food." His words choked me. My grandfather, the man who had stood strong through Wyoming's harshest winters, who taught me how to fix fences and tend cattle, was now begging for the bare minimum. But my father wasn't moved. "You're always asking for something," he snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. "We've given you a roof over your head. Isn't that enough?" My mother said nothing, just stood there, her gaze complicit in my father's anger. Then everything happened too fast. My grandfather, hands shaking, tried to carry the soup bowl to the sink, but it slipped from his grasp, crashing to the floor and shattering. The sound of breaking porcelain echoed, and I saw my father step forward, his face red with rage. "Can't you do anything carefully?" he roared, his voice drowning out the rain outside. My grandfather shrank back, raising his hands as if to apologize, but my father didn't stop. I froze as I saw him grab my grandfather's frail arm, dragging him toward the back door of the house. My heart stopped. No, he couldn't do that. But he did. In the flickering light of the camera, I saw my father fling open the back door, revealing the pitch-black rain outside. The wind howled, carrying icy droplets. He shoved my grandfather out onto the porch without hesitation. My grandfather stumbled, his thin old coat no match for his frail frame. He tried to grip the doorframe, but my father slammed the door shut, leaving him trembling in the storm. My mother appeared in the frame, watching from a distance, not saying a word, not making a move to stop it. The door closed and my grandfather's figure vanished into the darkness. I sat there, hands shaking violently, the phone nearly slipping from my grip. My breathing came in gasps, as if I were the one standing in that rain. The image of my grandfather, the man who taught me everything about honesty and family love, pushed out onto the porch like discarded trash, made me feel like the world was collapsing. I didn't think anymore. I grabbed my car keys and rushed out of the apartment, heedless of the rain and wind battering the windows. I had to get there. I had to take my grandfather away right now. My pickup truck sped through the slick streets, headlights blurred in the thick rain. The windshield wipers screeched, but they couldn't drown out the pounding of my heart. I couldn't erase the image of my grandfather hunched on the porch, shivering in his old coat. I had known my parents weren't keeping their promise, that they had used him. But I never imagined they could be this cruel. Every time I thought of his lost, lonely eyes, I pressed harder on the gas, as if a single second's delay would mean losing him forever. When I reached my parents' house, the rain was still pouring like a waterfall. I parked right at the gate, not bothering to turn off the engine, and bolted out. The rain stung my face, icy cold, but I didn't care. I ran around to the back of the house, to the porch by the back door. And there he was, a small, hunched figure sitting under a tree near the fence, trying to shield himself from the rain with his thin coat. My grandfather, once a symbol of strength in my eyes, now looked like a lost child abandoned in the storm. "Grandpa!" I shouted, my voice breaking in the wind. I ran to him, dropped to my knees, and hugged him tightly. His body was freezing, soaked through, and his hands trembled as they clung to me. "Caleb," he whispered, his voice faint, "what are you doing here? It's pouring. It's dangerous to be out." I didn't let him finish. I held him tighter, my tears mixing with the rain on my face. "It's okay, Grandpa," I said, my voice choked. "I'm taking you with me. You're not staying here anymore." I helped him stand, guiding him to the truck. He moved slowly, each step heavy, as if the storm had drained his strength. I opened the passenger door, helped him into the seat, and wrapped an old blanket from the back around him. "I'm taking you to my place," I said, though my small apartment had little more than a bed and a few odds and ends. But I knew anywhere was better than this house, where promises were betrayed and family ties trampled. As I drove away from my parents' house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The grand house stood tall in the rain, but to me it was no different from a prison. I knew my parents wouldn't let this go easily when they found out I'd taken my grandfather, but I didn't care. I just wanted him safe, to feel the love he deserved. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't the end. The storm that night wasn't just rain and wind. It was a harbinger of a bigger fight, a battle to protect my grandfather and everything he'd taught me. On the drive to my apartment, my grandfather sat silently, his head resting against the window. I glanced at him, seeing his eyes closed, his breathing faint. I gripped the steering wheel, fighting back tears. "He'll be okay," I told myself, but the fear of losing him grew stronger. I didn't know that just a few days later everything would change forever. But in that moment, in the storm, I had one goal: to get my grandfather out of the darkness, even if only for now. My small apartment in Billings was nothing special. A cramped room with an old bed, a scratched-up desk, and an ancient TV sitting on a wooden stand. The rain battered the window, making a soft murmuring sound like a sad song. I helped my grandfather inside, guiding him slowly, carefully, as if he were a fragile piece of glass. He was soaked, his thin jacket clinging to his frail frame. I grabbed an old towel, drying his hair and hands, then found a set of dry clothes from my closet. "Wear these for now, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice cheerful, though my heart felt heavy. He only nodded, his eyes tired but kind. I gave him the only bed in the apartment. "Lie down here and rest," I said, pulling the blanket over him. He tried to protest, his voice weak. "Caleb, I don't want you sleeping on the floor." "I'm fine." But I shook my head, smiling. "Don't worry about it. I've slept on the floor plenty of times. It's no big deal." I spread a thin blanket on the floor, lay down, and listened to the rain and his faint breathing. In the darkness, I felt his presence like a small, flickering light in the midst of a storm. But I also felt an invisible fear, as if our time together was slipping away second by second. The next morning, the sun peeked out weakly through gray clouds. Grandpa was still asleep, his breathing steadier, but he looked pale, his thin hands resting on the blanket as if clutching something fragile. I brewed a cup of hot tea, placed it on the small table by the bed, and decided to go back to my parents' house. I didn't want him staying in that house for another second, so I resolved to collect his clothes, medicine, and the little things he cherished, like the notebook he loved to write in or the photo of him and Grandma taken in a Wyoming field. When I arrived at my parents' lavish house, sunlight glinted off the sparkling glass windows, but it couldn't hide the coldness inside. My parents were in the dining room, eating breakfast with toast and coffee as if nothing had happened the night before. I stood in the doorway, fists clenched, trying to stay calm. "I took Grandpa to my place," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "How could you do that to him? You promised to take care of him." My father looked up, his eyes cold. "You had the nerve to do that?" he said, his voice eerily calm. "Do you know how worried we were last night? He broke things, made a mess of the house. I just wanted to teach him a lesson, bring him back here now." Blood rushed to my head. "You pushed him out into a storm. He's 78, Dad. He's so weak he can barely stand." My mother, sitting nearby, set her coffee cup down, her eyes avoiding mine. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "We didn't do anything wrong. He's a nuisance, old and clumsy. We just wanted him to be more careful." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to scream, to smash everything in that extravagant dining room, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. My parents wouldn't admit their fault. To them, Grandpa was just a means to get the money from the ranch, and now that he was no longer useful, they were ready to cast him aside. I turned away without another word and went to Grandpa's room. I packed his clothes, a few old books, and the photo of him and Grandma in the field. As I left the house, I looked back one last time, feeling an unbridgeable gap between me and my parents. I knew our family was broken forever. Back at the apartment, Grandpa was awake, sitting in the armchair by the window, looking out at the quiet Billings Street. "Caleb," he said, his voice weak but gentle. "You don't have to do this. I don't want to be a burden." I knelt beside him, taking his hand. "You're not a burden," I said, my voice choking. "You're family. I'm doing this because I love you." He looked at me, his eyes glistening, and I saw a faint smile, the first genuine one in days. In the days that followed, I worked harder than ever. I took extra Uber shifts, driving from early morning to late at night, sometimes sleeping only a few hours to afford his medicine and food. My tiny apartment became a sanctuary for us. We lived simply like he used to on the ranch. Breakfast was fried eggs and toast, dinner a pot of vegetable soup I learned to make from Grandma's recipe. I wasn't great in the kitchen, but every time Grandpa finished his bowl, smiled and said, "That was good, Caleb." I felt like I'd accomplished something big. We spent hours talking, like we used to on the ranch. He told me about Wyoming's harsh winters when he and Grandma stayed up all night to keep the cattle from freezing. I shared stories about my Uber passengers, the drunk old man singing country songs the whole ride, or the young woman sobbing over a breakup. He laughed, his voice raspy but warm, and I felt like I was a kid again, when life was simple and whole. At night, we'd watch TV, an old Western show he loved. He'd point at the screen and say, "I used to dream of being a cowboy, Caleb. But your grandma said, 'Warren, you're already my cowboy.'" I laughed, picturing Grandpa in a cowboy hat, riding across a Wyoming field. Those moments, small as they were precious gems shining through the dark days. One day we took a walk around the neighborhood, him leaning on his cane, moving slowly while I stayed close, ready to catch him if he tired. Passers-by looked at us, an old man and a young guy, and I saw them smile. "Your grandpa?" An old woman selling flowers by the roadside asked. I nodded, proud. "He's the best man I know." Grandpa Hurd turned to me, his eyes glistening again. "Caleb," he whispered, "thank you for always being there." I took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Your family," I said. "Nothing's more important than that." But those peaceful days were fleeting, like a beautiful song cut short. A week after the stormy night, I noticed Grandpa weakening noticeably. His coughs grew heavier, and sometimes he gasped for breath, clutching the chair to stay balanced. I stood by, my heart tightening, watching the man who once stood strong like an oak, now fragile as a dry branch in the wind. Each cough of his was like a knife slicing into my heart, a reminder that our time was running out. I didn't want to believe Grandpa was slipping away, but the signs were too clear. Each morning, as I brewed tea and placed it by his bed, I saw how much harder it was for him to sit up. His hands, once calloused from years of ranch work, now trembled so much he could barely hold a cup. One time he tried to eat a bowl of porridge I'd made, but after a few minutes he set the spoon down, exhausted, breathing heavily. "Caleb," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to lean close to hear, "I'm sorry for being a burden." I took his hand, squeezing it tightly, fighting back tears. "You're not a burden," I said. "I just want you to get better." But I knew he wasn't getting better. That stormy night when my father pushed him out onto the porch, leaving him soaked in the biting cold, had sapped his last strength. I blamed myself for not coming sooner, for not stopping my parents from the start. But I also knew self-blame wouldn't help. I had to do what was best for him, no matter how little time we had left. One morning, I decided to take him to the doctor. I helped him into the pickup truck, carefully wrapping a blanket around him to keep him warm. On the way to the hospital, he sat silently, staring out the window, his eyes distant as if searching for the far-off Wyoming fields. "Do you remember the days on the ranch?" he suddenly asked, his voice raspy. I smiled, though my heart was heavy. "I remember, Grandpa. I remember how you taught me to fix fences, and that time I spilled the milk bucket and you didn't scold me." He gave a faint smile, but a violent cough cut him off, making him clutch his chest, his face pale. At the hospital, the doctor examined Grandpa with a grave expression. He pulled me aside, his voice low. "He's very weak, Caleb," he said, looking me in the eye. "His age, combined with that night in the rain, his body can't handle it anymore. We can prescribe some supplements and pain relief to keep him comfortable, but you should prepare yourself. He may not make it through the next few weeks." Those words hit me like a blow to the chest. I stood there, frozen, feeling like the world was collapsing. "A few weeks?" I mumbled, my voice trembling. The doctor placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes sympathetic. "Spend time with him. That's the best thing you can do now." I nodded, but inside I wanted to scream, to beg someone for more time with Grandpa. Back at the apartment, I stayed by his side day and night. I pulled the armchair next to his bed, sitting there, listening to his faint breaths. At night, when he coughed violently, I'd jump up, help him sit, and rub his back until the coughing eased. One night, he woke up, his eyes dim with exhaustion, and grabbed my hand. "Caleb," he whispered, "I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid you'll be sad." I bowed my head, tears falling onto his hand. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice choked, "but I'll be here until the very end." He smiled, weak but gentle, then closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. In the days that followed, I did everything to make him comfortable. I cooked the foods he liked, even if it was just thin porridge or vegetable soup, since he couldn't eat much. I turned on the TV, playing the old Western shows he loved, and sat by him, pretending to laugh as he pointed at the screen and recounted his youthful dreams of being a cowboy. But every time he coughed, every time he paused mid-story to catch his breath, a cold fear ran down my spine. I trembled, not from the cold, but because I knew I was losing him. One morning, early sunlight slipped through the window, illuminating Grandpa's face. I woke up, sat up from the armchair, and looked at him. He lay still on the bed, his hands resting on his chest, his face peaceful as if asleep. But I knew in that moment that he was gone. His breathing had stopped, and the room became eerily silent. I knelt by the bed, took his hand, and felt the coldness of the fingers that had once taught me how to hold a shovel, how to milk a cow. "Thank you for everything," I whispered, tears streaming onto the floor. I sobbed, not just for losing him, but for all he'd endured. My parents' betrayal, the loneliness of his final days, and the love he'd given me even when he had nothing left to give. Grandpa's death was a profound loss, as if a piece of my heart had been torn away. But in that pain, I felt a small flame ignite. He was gone, but his story, the story of honor, love, and the Ellison family legacy, was not over. I knew his passing would pave the way for the truth to come to light. And as I knelt by his bed that morning, I swore to myself that I would do everything to protect what he'd left behind, no matter the cost. The days after Grandpa's death left me hollow, like a ghost wandering in my own life. My small apartment in Billings felt empty, even though everything remained unchanged. The bed where he once lay, the teacup he never got to drink from, and the photo of him and Grandma in the Wyoming field still sitting on the table. Every time I looked at that photo, I saw him smiling, his eyes bright as they were when I was a child, chasing him around the ranch. But now, that smile was just a memory, and I had to face a cold reality. Grandpa was gone, and those responsible for his pain, my parents, continued living comfortably in their lavish house as if nothing had happened. My parents arranged Grandpa's funeral, and I'll admit they made it grand. The funeral home was adorned with white flowers, the oak coffin gleamed, and a pre-written eulogy overflowed with flowery words about a respected father. Dad stood before everyone, his voice low and somber, talking about how Grandpa had lived a full life, how he passed peacefully, surrounded by family. Mom stood beside him, eyes teary, dabbing them with an expensive handkerchief. The mourners, neighbors, Grandpa's old friends, and my parents' acquaintances whispered to each other about my parents' devotion. "They took care of him until the end," an elderly woman said, her voice full of sympathy. I stood in the corner, fists clenched, feeling a fire burning in my chest. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know how Grandpa had been treated, how, on that stormy night, he was pushed out onto the porch like discarded trash. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone about my parents' betrayal, but I held back. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew Grandpa wouldn't want me to make a scene on the day he was laid to rest. He always taught me that justice doesn't need to be loud. It requires steadfastness and truth. So I stood there silently, bowing my head before his coffin, and whispered, "I'll do right by you, Grandpa. I promise." After the funeral, I returned to the apartment and began sorting through Grandpa's things. I wanted to keep everything tied to him, from the notebook he loved to write in to the old jacket he wore during that stormy night. While cleaning, I found a small suitcase under the bed where I'd stored his belongings when I brought him here. The suitcase was worn, its leather faded, a relic of his years on the ranch. I opened it, hands trembling, unsure of what I'd find. Inside were a few clothes, a notebook, and a sealed envelope with shaky handwriting. To Caleb. My heart pounded. I held the letter, feeling its weight as if it carried Grandpa's entire life. I sat on the floor back against the bed and opened it. His handwritten words appeared, the script shaky but clear, as if he'd poured his last strength into writing it. I read, and each word carved itself into my heart. My dearest Caleb, by the time you read this, I may no longer be here. I know I don't have much time left, and I've accepted that. But I couldn't leave without telling you the truth. I know your father, Mark, never truly cared for me. I had hoped, believed that he would keep his promise to take care of me, but I was wrong. I'm sorry for trusting too much, for making you witness such painful things. But don't let sadness consume you. Justice may come late, but it will come if you don't give up. In this suitcase, I've left everything I have. Not money, but the truth. Use it to reclaim my honor, our family's honor. Live kindly, Caleb. Let truth be your weapon. I love you, always. Your grandpa, Warren Ellison. Tears fell onto the paper, smudging a few words. I clutched the letter, feeling as if Grandpa were right there, speaking to me in his warm, steady voice from our ranch days. I wiped my eyes, set the letter aside, and continued exploring the suitcase. Beneath it was a thick, hard-bound folder filled with papers, receipts, and a small diary. I opened the diary, instantly recognizing Grandpa's handwriting. Its pages detailed his time living with my parents. Every insult, every moment of neglect, every instance he felt like a burden. One entry read, "Today Mark yelled at me for spilling water. Elaine didn't make the porridge I asked for, told me to fend for myself. I don't want to be a bother, but I'm so tired. Maybe I don't belong here." I read on, my heart aching. He documented everything from my parents' exasperated sighs to the evenings he sat alone in his room, ignored. But what stunned me were the other documents in the folder. The contract for the ranch sale, bank statements, and a signed agreement with a lawyer. They all showed that my father had received the full $3.5 million, along with a written promise to care for my father until his final days. These documents weren't just legal evidence. They were Grandpa's final confession, his trust in me to do what was right. I sat there on the apartment floor, clutching the folder, tears streaming down my face. What Grandpa left behind wasn't just papers. It was a message, a last will that I had to stand up, not just for him, but for the values he taught me: honor, truth, and family love. I held the folder tightly, feeling the fire in my heart burn brighter. Grandpa didn't want me to drown in grief or hatred. He wanted me to be a guardian of justice, a keeper of the Ellison family legacy. I stood up, placing the letter and folder on the table beside the photo of him and Grandma. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating Grandpa's smile in the picture. I looked at it, whispering, "I'll do it, Grandpa. I won't let you down." In that moment, I knew I stood at a crossroads. My parents might think everything ended with Grandpa's passing, but they were wrong. The truth he left behind would be my weapon, and I would use it to seek justice, not just for him, but for our entire family. I began preparing the case, determined to sue my own parents, a decision that was truly heartbreaking and difficult. Every night after exhausting Uber shifts, I sat under the dim glow of a lamp, copying every page of Grandpa's diary, scanning every bank receipt, and carefully saving the security camera footage from the stormy night. The images of my father shoving Grandpa out onto the porch, my mother watching coldly, were stored on a USB drive, a sharp, undeniable piece of evidence. I worked with meticulous, almost obsessive care, as if each page, each second of video was a piece of the promise I made to Grandpa. But I was also afraid. Suing my own parents wasn't just a legal battle, it was a deep cut into my heart, a confrontation that would forever alter our family ties. I sought out Raymond Carter, a well-known lawyer in Billings who had handled numerous cases involving elder abuse and civil disputes. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes, and a calm voice. When I placed the folder on his desk, he flipped through each page, read Grandpa's letter, and watched the video from that stormy night. The office was silent, save for the sound of turning pages and my pounding heart. When he looked up, his expression was stern but resolute. "You have a very strong case, Caleb," he said. "They didn't just mistreat your grandfather, they breached a contract. The ranch sale agreement clearly states your father was to care for him until the end. This video, along with the diary and documents, is irrefutable evidence. I nodded, feeling a surge of strength within me mixed with fear. But suing my own parents? I mumbled, my voice trailing off. Mr. Carter placed a hand on my shoulder, his tone low but firm. I understand, Caleb. This isn't just a courtroom battle. People will talk and your conscience will be tested, but you're doing this for justice, for your grandfather. Do you have the courage to see it through? I looked into his eyes, thinking of Grandpa's letter, of the days he was neglected, pushed out into the storm. I'm not doing this out of hatred, I said, my voice steady. I'm doing it for justice for my grandfather. Mr. Carter nodded and got to work. Over the next few days, he prepared the lawsuit listing the charges: elder abuse, fraud in a transaction, coercion of an elderly person, and breach of the care agreement tied to the property transfer. I sat beside him, watching him write each line, feeling as if we were building a wall to protect Grandpa's legacy. When the lawsuit was filed with the Billings Civil Court, I felt both relief and a heavy weight. The official summons was sent to my parents, and I knew it wouldn't be long before I'd face them, not just as their son, but as someone seeking justice. The day the summons was delivered, my parents showed up at my apartment. The doorbell rang sharply like a warning. When I opened the door, I saw my father standing there, his face red with fury, clutching a copy of the summons. My mother stood behind him, eyes red, though I wasn't sure if her tears were real or just an act. "You dare sue your own parents?" Dad roared, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "You want to disgrace this family?" I stood tall, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart. "I'm not trying to disgrace anyone," I said, my voice cold but firm. "I just want justice for Grandpa. You promised to take care of him, but you betrayed him." Mom stepped forward, her voice choked, but I saw anger in her eyes. "You're tearing this family apart, Caleb," she said, clutching her handkerchief tightly. "All for an old man who's gone. Don't you think about us?" Her words cut like a knife, but I didn't back down. I pulled a copy of the summons from my pocket and held it up before them. "He wasn't just an old man," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "He was the one who gave you everything. You took his money, promised to care for him, then pushed him out into a storm. I'll see this through. Not for me, but for him." Dad lunged forward as if to strike me, but he stopped, his fists clenched. "You'll regret this, Caleb," he growled, then turned, pulling Mom along. They left, leaving me standing there, heart pounding but resolve unshaken. I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. Word of the lawsuit spread through Billings. Gossip swirled from neighbors to church members. Some criticized me, calling me an ungrateful son for suing my own parents. "Who does he think he is?" I overheard one of Dad's acquaintances say at a coffee shop. But others supported me, especially those who had seen Grandpa trembling in front of my parents' house. "You're doing the right thing," an elderly woman told me after a church service. "Warren deserved respect." The pressure weighed heavily on my shoulders. Every night I sat in my apartment looking at the photo of Grandpa and Grandma, rereading his letter. "Live kindly, Caleb. Let truth be your weapon." Those words were like a guiding light, helping me push through moments of self-doubt. I wasn't doing this to destroy our family, as Mom claimed. I was doing it to protect what was left of it, not money or land, but the honor and love Grandpa had spent his life preserving. I knew the upcoming trial wouldn't be easy. My parents wouldn't go down without a fight, but I was ready. With Grandpa's letter in my heart, the folder as evidence, and the fire of justice burning within me, I would face them, not as their son, but as the guardian of Grandpa's legacy. The day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the Billings Civil Court was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. I walked into the courtroom clutching the folder tightly, feeling as if the weight of the world rested on my shoulders. The room was packed, neighbors, Grandpa's old friends, and curious onlookers eager to witness a rare case, a son suing his own parents. I sat beside my lawyer, Raymond Carter, trying to stay calm despite my pounding heart. Across the room, my parents sat with their lawyer, a tall, thin man with a piercing gaze. My father stared straight at me, his eyes filled with anger and disdain as if I were a traitor. My mother kept her head down, avoiding my gaze, but I knew she wasn't remorseful. She was only afraid of public opinion. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, banged her gavel to open the trial. The sharp sound echoed, a declaration that there was no turning back. Raymond stood, his voice low and steady, and began presenting the case. "Your Honor," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, "we are here to seek justice for Mr. Warren Ellison, a man who was exploited, abused, and betrayed by his son and daughter-in-law. They coerced him into selling the family ranch, a multi-generational legacy, with the promise of caring for him until the end of his life. But instead of care, they neglected him, insulted him, and pushed him out into a storm, leading to the decline of his health and ultimately his death." I sat there listening to Raymond's words, feeling as though he was recounting the pain I had lived through. He presented the ranch sale contract, holding up a copy with my father's signature, which clearly stated the obligation to care for my father until his final days. He read an excerpt from Grandpa's diary, his voice lowering with emotion. "Today, Mark yelled at me for spilling water. Elaine told me to fend for myself. I don't want to be a bother, but I'm so tired." The courtroom fell silent, broken only by the rustle of papers and faint whispers from the spectators. I saw an elderly woman in the back row wipe away tears, and I knew the truth was beginning to reach them. Then Raymond requested to play the security camera footage from the stormy night. The large screen in the courtroom lit up, and the images appeared. Grandpa huddled in the kitchen, a cold bowl of soup in front of him, my father yelling in his face before dragging him to the back door and shoving him out into the black pouring rain. My mother stood watching, not saying a word to stop it. The sound of the storm roared through the speakers, mingling with Grandpa's faint, desperate apologies. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I bowed my head, unable to watch, but the sound of the rain and the door slamming shut echoed in my mind as if I were reliving that night. Raymond concluded his presentation, his voice sharp. "This is not just elder abuse, it is a breach of contract, fraud, and coercion of a vulnerable elderly person. We ask the court to declare the ranch sale contract void, return the property to Mr. Warren Ellison's estate, and hold the defendants accountable for their wrongful actions." On the other side, my parents' lawyer stood, his voice smooth but calculated. "Your Honor," he said, "my clients, Mr. Mark and Mrs. Elaine Ellison, did not coerce Mr. Warren Ellison. He willingly sold the ranch and was provided with a home and a comfortable life. The video is merely a moment of misunderstanding, a fleeting instance of frustration that any family might experience." He turned to me, his gaze piercing. "As for the plaintiff, Caleb Ellison, he is nothing more than an ungrateful son, attempting to smear his family for personal gain." His words hit like a punch, but I stayed silent, my fists clenched under the table. My father spoke next, his voice calm but brimming with confidence. "I didn't force my father," he said. "He wanted to sell the ranch to live close to family. We did our best to care for him." My mother stood as well, her eyes teary, her voice choked. "We loved Dad. That video doesn't reflect the truth. We just lost control for a moment." But their defenses were frail, like a breeze too weak to extinguish the fire of justice burning in the courtroom. The trial stretched on for hours, but to me it felt like an endless moment. Every word, every piece of evidence was a step toward justice. I sat there, hands clenched under the table, my heartbeat blending with the murmurs of the spectators. When the judge banged her gavel for the final time, calling for a recess to deliberate, I felt the entire room hold its breath with me. My parents stood, their eyes avoiding mine, but I knew they still held hope. Hope that the facade they'd built would shield the truth. I was different. With Grandpa's letter in my heart, I was ready for anything. The days waiting for the verdict were the longest of my life. Billings buzzed with gossip. Some people sent me messages of support saying I'd done the right thing. "Warren would be proud of you," a neighbor wrote. But there were also harsh criticisms from my parents' friends, calling me an ungrateful son tearing the family apart. I read them, felt the sting, but didn't waver. Grandpa had taught me that justice isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Then the day of the verdict arrived. I stepped into the courtroom again, the air heavier than ever. The judge sat, her face expressionless, but when she began to speak, her voice rang clear and uncompromising. After reviewing all the evidence, she said, "This court declares the Ellison Ranch sale contract void due to undue influence, coercion, and exploitation of a vulnerable elderly person. All funds and assets related to the sale will revert to the estate of Mr. Warren Ellison. The plaintiff, Caleb Ellison, who cared for Mr. Warren in his final days, will have full authority to manage this estate. He is the sole rightful heir." Her words were like a cool breeze sweeping through the stifling room. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, not from sadness but from relief. Justice had finally spoken. My parents sat across the room, their faces pale. My father slammed the table, his voice trembling with rage. "This is a mistake. We did nothing wrong." But the judge banged her gavel, warning him to be silent. My mother bowed her head, crying, but I knew it wasn't genuine remorse, just bitterness over their shattered plans. Their lawyer shook his head, knowing their weak defenses couldn't stand against the evidence. The contract, the diary, the stormy night video, and the testimonies of those who knew Grandpa well. As the trial ended, people stood, their whispers spreading like a wave. Supporters patted my shoulder, murmuring congratulations. "You did it," Raymond Carter said, shaking my hand firmly. "Your grandfather would be smiling from above." I nodded, my voice choked. "Thank you." This wasn't just my victory, it was his. My parents left the courtroom without looking at me, their figures small and lonely amidst the crowd. I knew that from now on they'd face the consequences, not just financial loss, but the collapse of the reputation they once flaunted. The repercussions for my parents came swiftly and harshly. The ranch money was reclaimed, and they had to repay the full $3.5 million, plus legal fees and damages for their abusive actions. My father's struggling restaurant collapsed entirely as friends and customers turned away. "How can I trust you after what you did to your own father?" an old acquaintance said to him in a coffee shop. The Billings community, where everyone knows each other, began whispering about them, not as a dutiful family, but as greedy betrayers. My mother, once charming with clients at her hair salon, now sat alone in their once lavish, now empty house, her eyes filled with resentment. They were drowning in debt, forced to sell off their assets. Our family was completely fractured. No more check-in calls, no more shared meals. They were no longer my refuge, but a painful wound, a harsh lesson in selfishness. But for me, the verdict wasn't the end of the pain. It was the start of a new journey. I inherited Grandpa's estate, a substantial sum, but I didn't use it for extravagance. I didn't buy a fancy car or a big house like my father once dreamed. Instead, I established the Warren Ellison Foundation, a fund to support elderly people in Billings and nearby areas who had been scammed or abused. The foundation would provide safe shelters, free legal aid, and emotional support, things Grandpa lacked. I imagined him smiling as he saw his name etched on the foundation's plaque, a symbol of the kindness he always embodied. Part of the money went toward buying back a piece of land in Sheridan County, Wyoming, not the entire old ranch, but enough to build a simple log cabin and a memorial stone for Grandpa. I drove there one autumn afternoon, the wind carrying the familiar scent of hay. The cabin stood quietly by the field where the soul of the Ellison family once thrived. On the stone, I had inscribed the words Grandpa taught me. "True value lies not in land or money, but in how we treat family." I stood there, touching the words, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun. Nearby, cows grazed lazily as if welcoming me home. The lessons Grandpa taught me as a child about honest work, love, and honor now guide my path. I understand that the greatest legacy he left wasn't money or land, but the lessons of justice, dignity, and living worthy of those we love. Our story doesn't end with a perfect resolution, but with a new beginning. My parents may continue living in regret and isolation, but I choose Grandpa's path: kindness, resilience, and love. Each time I look out at the Wyoming field from the cabin, I whisper, "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." And I know somewhere he's smiling because I kept my promise.